I'm here too, Tracy.
Hi, Leslie.
Yeah.
And Marilyn's here.
Marilyn, and
Hi,
then
Marilyn.
Kyle. Kyle
Yeah,
said,
hi, Marilyn's here too.
yeah. What did someone tell me in Delaware? You've either mated or dated everyone in the state.
Or graduated with.
Okay, that was the third part. Well, why don't we get started? We're really honored to have First Lady Carney, the First Lady of the state of Delaware, one of the first states in the country to sign the Constitution and to become trauma-informed both. We're really honored to have you. A couple of short announcements before I turn it over to Kyle Shepard from Congresswoman Rochester's office, then to Jesse, and then finally to our two presenters who will be talking on one of the most pressing issues facing this country, which is racial inequality and how trauma-informed approaches can help provide solutions to that issue. First of all, many of you are probably already aware of it, but the PBS NewsHour is doing a week-long series on ACEs and trauma. If you haven't caught it, you still could catch the last 3 days, and I think you can even go back on YouTube and catch the earlier sessions. They've really done a good job. They had Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris the first day laying out the science, and she's just so articulate. And but more importantly, to me, it's just a real signal that this issue has now reached the national conscience. And hopefully this will help to create the momentum all of us have been working so hard to create. Secondly, here in Washington, our Congress looks like it's getting ready to pass a stimulus bill. They had no choice. What Winston Churchill said, Americans try everything that doesn't work until they finally settle on the right thing, and Congress is doing that. The bill, unfortunately, is not going to contain money for state and local governments, which is one of the sources of trauma-informed programming in the CARES Act, but it will contain money for education. So it could open opportunity to talk to your local education agencies about using some of that money to provide trauma-informed programs for the kids and teachers when they come back to school with all of the extra layer of trauma that the pandemic has laid on top of the existing trauma so many of our communities have. So we'll keep you posted on that, but I think they're actually about to, as we speak, put something on the table, if not tomorrow. The third issue, opioid. The opioid lawsuits are coming to a closure, producing settlement agreements with money going to state and local communities. And we urge you to keep your eye open for what's happening in your state and your community. While so much of the focus for opioid, the whole opioid issue has been on treatment for those already suffering from opioid abuse disorder, some of that money has to be used for prevention and mitigation. Otherwise, we're going to have another generation of people with the problem. And so it's really incumbent on the trauma-informed community to educate those who are making decisions about the money to allocate some of it to prevention and mitigation using trauma-informed approaches. On that note, one of the new CTIPP initiatives is to work with state legislators, and a state legislator from New York, Assemblyman Hevesy, that Jen O'Connor was introduced us to, and a representative from Oklahoma, Sherry Conley, have agreed to co-chair a committee of trauma-informed state legislators. We pulled together some information. 29 different states have had trauma-informed legislation introduced, and we're going to contact the sponsors of those bills to invite them to be the initial members of the Trauma-Informed Committee. The goal is to provide them information like when the opioid issue comes, be sure to advocate for some of that opioid money used for trauma-informed programs. So we'll keep you posted on that. If any of you have state legislators that you know are trauma-informed advocates, please let me know, and we'll add their names to the invitation list when the initial invitation goes out. Also tomorrow, the National Conference of State Legislators is having a webinar on trauma-informed for state legislators. Not coincidentally, Assemblyman Hevesy and Representative Conley are two of the presenters. So you can still sign up for that by going on to the National Conference of State Legislators website. One last issue. We're trying to compile information on cost savings achieved by trauma-informed programs. Good hard data that financial analysts would look at and say, yeah, that's worth putting an investment into, that the money will be repaid back. So if any of you are aware of programs that have been able to document savings, such as school programs, we know that schools that implement trauma-informed program have better attendance, they have lower teacher turnover. All of those convert into dollar savings, but we're having trouble finding very specific examples where someone has actually tracked the dollars. So if you're aware of any of that, please let us know. With that, I'd like to turn over the microphone to our first guest. We're fortunate that Congresswoman Rochester from Delaware, Blunt Rochester, sorry, has introduced legislation that's really germane to today's subject. And I'm looking for Kyle. Are you still there?
I'm here.
Okay. Kyle, I'll let you introduce yourself. I know you're an intern, but I don't realize, and I also understand you're working on your PhD because somebody said that you were in their class. So with that, why don't you introduce yourself and then talk a little bit about the Congresswoman's legislation?
Absolutely. Thanks, Dan. Were you able to send out the one pager in advance, or should I drop a link in the?
Why don't you put it on the screen? Jesse,
Yeah,
you can
drop a link, but I did share it with folks in the emails that we sent out ahead of time.
So I wish I had a link for the one pager. Here's a link for the overall bill text. But then if somebody has a chance to share screen with the one pager as I'm talking, that'll be just fine.
Happy to do that.
Thanks so much. So just introducing myself. Thanks again, Dan, for the conversations that we had the other week. Starting off just with myself. So my name is Kyle Shepard. I'm a native of Delaware resident, and I am a legislative fellow with the Congresswoman's office. So based in the DC office, but during this COVID-19 environment, now we're doing a lot of work from home, which is, has its pros and its cons, but thank you all for being here. And what you'll be looking at on the screen, depending on if we can zoom in a little bit, but I'll talk through it. Really want to talk about the Invest in Community Healing Act. To go further in my background, one of my colleagues that Dan met with me was one of the supporters who drafted a lot of this text, but she did have a time conflict today. So I'll do the best that I can serving on her behalf, as well as the Congresswoman. The Congresswoman, Blunt Rochester, she's somebody who, knows tragedy and knows trauma well herself. After losing her husband in 2014 unexpectedly. Something that she talks about a lot is, being on this earth and being involved in this work is really about the importance of sharing love and embodying love, not just in the work that we do, but the way that we show up for other people. So that was something that we've seen this year. I know this topic is about the intersections of race as well as trauma-informed care. The Congresswoman, during this summer, we saw bills like that of the Justice for All agenda produced at the national scale. The Congresswoman saw herself visiting the sites of protests here in Wilmington, here in Delaware, as well as our governor, whose first lady we have on the call today, is really thankful to have people who make sure that we show up to the site of justice or injustice and where that's taking place, to make sure that we're staying and keeping those things central to the work that we do and the things that we advocate for. She also saw herself going up and traveling up to Philadelphia, unfortunately in October, with the untimely death of Walter Wallace Jr., who was shot and killed by police during an episode of mental health. And that is something that leads us, to where we're at now. So she really wants to make sure that we keep the realities of the people who are experiencing the problems central to her work. And that's one of the reasons, what she's advocating for right now is that direct payments and survival checks, as some are calling them, to try to get those out to our residents and our constituents. So this bill text that you're looking at, some background is a lot of trauma-informed persons on the call. So we know that trauma impacts whole communities, right? And when we think about state violence is violence that's enacted by the state or its bodies. So we think about something that can take place in care facilities, takes place through law enforcement or other means of security forces. And something that's within state violence, we think about structural violence, right? And structures are something that perpetuate an inequity that cause suffering that's ultimately preventable, something that we can actually diagnose, analyze, treat, and improve, right? Not just something that happens through happenstance. I think that's the work that CTIPP certainly advocates for, as well as its partners. The reasoning behind this bill text, we really want to increase the analysis and the action. So not just researching and studying the problem for the sake of studying the problem, but also making sure that we're acting on what is the impact of police violence, not just on those directly involved physically, but those within a community, right? So when we digest and continue to see over and over different scenes of police violence and racial tension and different protests that we see from the nation's capital all throughout our states, those things can weigh on us as a community, as a society. And the focus of this bill was to really draw focus on that and incentivize and expand research that would be able to tackle that. So thank you again for Dan and team for sending out this legislation. And maybe if we have time for Q&A or as the session wraps up, we can talk more about it.
If people have questions now, we'll put some time aside right now if people have some questions.
Absolutely, thank you. So just a few more notes. So something that the legislature really wants to do is expand access and resources to community-based organizations, right? But specifically those with that cultural responsiveness to mental health and behavioral needs and services. And something else on the back end of just providing those resources and that access is really making sure that through Health and Human Services, which of course would trickle down to the state level, to conduct research on the impact of trauma related to state violence. And to really broaden that out much more. So it's not just so much of a thing that we do over there in that equity initiative, but we start to place equity and trauma-informed care at everything that we do and everything that we look at. And we'll be able to talk more about that. Even beyond this piece of legislation, I want to circle or complement those things. Something that the Congresswoman has been looking at since 2019 is also the Caring for Social Determinants of Health. That's HR 4621. And that's something that herself and co-sponsor out of Florida, we're really looking at, because again, the social determinants of health, and I may be preaching to the choir for a lot of people here, but it's like, again, with the structural violence, what are the things within somebody's community that they're going through, whether that's a school structure, whether that's a neighborhood, community-based structure, when we think about law enforcement, but what are the things that are leading to that increase in interaction between police or law enforcement, and again, just the state in those different arenas. So that Caring for Social Determinants of Health bill, again, is HR 4621. And then something that unfortunately we have our work cut out for us in the state of Delaware, as well as a lot of other communities throughout the nation, is a cycle of violence. So gun violence, as well as intracommunal and domestic violence. So one of those bills is breaking the cycle of violence, and that's HR 4836 as well that the Congresswoman is a co-sponsor for. And again, that just similar to this Investing in Community Healing Act is to really make sure that we can expand some of the services and the research and the funds to directly go to community, grassroots, and agencies who have and are employing that responsive lens to equity. And I think that's, where I want to tie this back into CTIPP and, see if we have some questions or just dialogue moving forward. But when we think about the National Trauma Campaign, right, and the importance of serving or instituting a liaison with Congress, we want to make sure that those efforts, right, and I think the pandemic and COVID-19, this public health crisis, has shown us where there's been some gaps between the federal level, the state and local neighborhood community action, but also what are the things that worked well? What are some of the ways that we've used this time to increase communication and make sure that we keep a patient and people-centered or centered rather to the issues in which we're trying to solve. So some takeaways I'll leave with from an acronym base. I don't think I would be in the right room if I didn't leave an acronym. Is to keep. So it's KEEP, and keep these four things, right? So the K is we think about keep the costs and the investments, right, at the cornerstone of the ask, and just how vital it is a lot of times when we walk into the room or the different stage that we're trying to set, excuse my background, the stages that we're trying to set, just to have a number ready, like what is the cost and the impact of the thing that we're trying to solve, or what is its impact on the back end, or what is the investments that we could be making on the front end, on the further upstream strategies. So really keeping those costs and the investments at the cornerstone of the ask. And then for the E is to make sure that we exhaust, just like CTIPP does, exhaust the arenas where public health approach is discussed and enacted, right? So making sure that we're placing that equity lens on just about everything that we do. We've seen states in this moment be able to look at the way that health with different divisions of public health, think about, well, how do we make sure that the people being in most need of vaccines and most need of testing and those strategies, how are their voices being included in the process within those strategies, right? And then the same thing for education. There's so many students who and families who have been left out of the dialogue or the to get in touch with during this time. And those are the experiences, if we keep those centered about how do we address those needs, I think that helps us to really keep that upstream strategy and that equity stream strategy as high as possible. The other E that we think about is what we're doing right now and what Dan and team have done beforehand and you all continue to do in the years is make sure that we educate policymakers and not just educate the policymakers, but empower the people with those lived experiences, right? It's so important that we have the people who know the lingo and know the language and may be involved in the profession, but making sure that we're keeping empathy, right? And keeping the people who are dealing with the pain and dealing with the dealing with the problems, at the forefront of this work and supporting them throughout the process to kind of tell their stories. And then that last P is really just about partnering. And I think you all do this now with the amount of coalitions and groups that you have working with. So just making sure that we're partnering with other coalitions that address, again, those social determinants of health. So we think about other factors and other traumas that affect us, gun violence, right? Infant mortality, as well as addiction, right? The opioid crisis and these things that have increased or been exacerbated by the pandemic. And one of those ways, we had a constituent that we met with some in recent weeks who lost her son due to an asthma attack that was intensified and brought on because of his vaping addiction, right? So when we think about groups like CTIPP and those who are addressing some of these other things in other arenas, how do we make sure we expand this coalition who's all talking about the same thing and wants to solve the same thing, but we need those investments and need those resources to really tackle these issues. So I kind of stopped there. I know I covered a lot, but hopefully, you have some chance to really look more into this resource. I know our team is fully available to continue to keep up the connection any way that we can and be a resource to CTIPP.
Thank you, Kyle. We will, again, follow up with the CTIPP-CAN call, and I will send out the link again in that, so that way everyone has it again if they didn't get it in the initial email. Do you plan on sticking around for the CTIPP-CAN call?
Absolutely. This is the part all about learning, so I won't be going anywhere and I'll be here.
So I would encourage us to, for the Q&A, if it's all right, to wait until after Teena and Father Paul's presentations, because a community conversation is baked into that. And if it's all right with all of you, I think that it would be really great to have all of that sort of going on at the same time.
Okay,
Um,
fine. Jesse, before you, I know you were supposed to go next, but I just recognized that we have somebody I talked about earlier, Representative Sherry Conley from Oklahoma, is on the call, and I'd just like her to introduce herself. She graciously volunteered to co-chair the Committee on State Legislators. So Sherry, do you want to introduce yourself to?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I am so honored to have been asked to co-chair the committee. I feel like this is really, really important work. I have family members who have experienced trauma and then and lived to tell the tale. And then I have experience as an educator. Uh-oh, is that background? Is that feedback for you guys?
you're okay.
Okay. And so I'm an educator and spent 26 years working with children and spent several years in areas where trauma is very high. And immediately I saw the need to ensure that our teachers are well trained and not just a class here and there, 30 minutes talking about trauma. They need to be very well informed. And so I'll talk tomorrow at the National NCSL about what I've done as far as my first few years in the House. But just wanted to say hi. I won't go on and on. I know you guys have an agenda, so I'm very excited to be part of this group and then helping out nationwide for trauma-informed care and resources and just getting the awareness out. So thank you very much for including me and allowing me to introduce myself to you.
Oh, thank. We look forward to a long working relationship with you.
Yes, very much so. Thank you, sir.
And First Lady, do you want to say a few words? I know you're going to be one of our presenters in February, but I wanted to not pass up an opportunity for you to talk, say hello to our group.
I appreciate it, and I will say hello and no more because I'm here to listen to and look forward to being on future calls. So thanks everybody for including me today. And thank you, Kyle, for your presentation on Lisa's behalf. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Jesse, you're on.
Awesome. So real quickly, last note is I will put into the chat a link to our 100-day priorities document. If many of you have signed on, we've had over 600 people signed. Thank you. If you haven't done so already, you can follow the steps in that ACEs Connection article and feel free to send me an email if you would like to sign on. I don't want to take up any more time because we have two more great speakers and presenters for this CTIPP-CAN call. And I have the true pleasure of introducing two of my colleagues from CTIPP, and more importantly, just amazing human beings doing incredible work in their communities. We have Father Paul Abernathy, who's the CEO of the Neighborhood Resilience Project and a CTIPP board member, who's going to explore with us the ways in which anti-racist and trauma-informed work may find synergy. This session will examine in ways in which we move toward justice and reconciliation in a way that invites collective and personal healing. And after him, we will have Teena Brooks, who is an LMSW, ABD. Teena, by the way, I do not know what ABD is, so if you want to fill us in on those initials, that would be great. And is also a CTIPP board member, member of the National Trauma Campaign Core Team, and an adjunct faculty member at the Columbia School of Social Work. Much of Teena's work has focused on understanding the impact of structural racism on health, and Teena will share her experiences integrating trauma-informed care with equity principles and discuss the National Trauma Campaign's effort to develop an equity plan. So with that, Father Paul, I turn it over to you. Thank you both for joining us. So looking forward to hearing from you.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
All right. Jesse, Dan, Congresswoman Conley, First Lady Carney, and all the rest of you, brothers and sisters. It's a distinct honor and blessing for me to be here with all of you today. As I'm sure we all know, this is a critical moment in the life of our nation. I will tell you that it is very good to teach history, but it is very problematic when we teach history as though it's something that happens to us, not as though it's something that is ours to write. This is our history to write, and we are at a crossroads right now where the future of many generations of Americans is being determined. A future that is uncertain and yet hopeful. A future that is ours and yet theirs. A future that is challenging, and yet we must acknowledge the opportunity in all of it. This year we have experienced a racial reckoning that was a long time in the making, and we must own it, and we must step forward, and we must participate in building this nation of ours that needs, brothers and sisters, a great deal of healing. I'm not the most qualified person to speak to this issue of synergy between the trauma-informed and anti-racist world. I'm not an expert in either regard. And yet, I spend my days among people who are suffering unimaginably. And I'm coming into this with the obligation to issue a calling, an exhortation, so to speak, that all of us have work to do, especially for the least of these, our brothers and sisters. And so with that, I just want to begin with some review. You know, there is such a thing as racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress. We have to acknowledge this. There's mental and emotional injury that results from these encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination. We have to begin there, that there is racism. And it's not only the personal experience of racism, but it's the experience of racism in broader institutions and structures that wound, these experiences, they wound. And these kinds of wounds are deep. They go deep into the psyche of men, women, and children who are raised up in these systems. They are deep, brothers and sisters. They resonate not only throughout our own lifetime, but can go multiple generations. These wounds are very deep. They're deep in the soul of our nation. There is a mental and emotional injury that we must acknowledge that can be caused by these kind of racist encounters. You see here, Black, Indigenous, people of color are the most vulnerable, living under a system of white supremacy, which has been our legacy in these beloved United States. These experiences of race-based discrimination, as we can see here, there's a detrimental psychological impact on individuals and their wider communities. We've got to acknowledge there's personal trauma. There's also collective trauma. And if we talk about racial trauma, race-based traumatic stress, we cannot talk about the personal trauma that people experience without also talking about the collective trauma that whole communities, whole peoples, generations of peoples have experienced. That what happens to one impacts the many. This is very much the experience whenever we look at what distinguishes racial trauma. And people who have experience of this, they can exhibit symptoms that can be like those we experience with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, this is not a mental health disorder. It's a mental injury that can occur as a result of living in a racist system. But it's very important to understand, again, the impact on person, the impact on community that this racial trauma happens. It can come from directly receiving it from someone else. It can also happen simply within a wider system. That is to say, if somebody says, and just as we talk about, it can be direct or it can be vicarious. If somebody says, well, have you ever been abused by a police officer? Even if the answer is, well, no, I've not personally ever been abused by a police officer. If we have seen images, if we know people who have been personally abused, if we have experienced that in our family narratives, then that continues to impact. It doesn't matter simply what we have directly experienced, but it's rather what our people have experienced, what has been the collective experience of our people. You know, there are many families that within their narratives, and you go into their narratives, you begin to hear the stories that have become the cornerstone of their family identity, the pain that's very often expressed. Sometimes those stories go back to slavery. Sometimes those stories go back to Jim Crow. Sometimes those stories go back to the Middle Passage. And in all of it, this narrative of pain and suffering impacts us vicariously, just as when we watch someone who looks like us suffer on our television screen that's broadcast across our nation and indeed the world. And you see, we as we're saying here, it's this experience of racial trauma as something that can be transmitted intergenerationally. You know, our Native American brothers and sisters, they the Great Law of Peace, the Iroquois, they had the Great Law of Peace, the Iroquois Confederation, and they asked themselves the question: if we are going to maintain peace between these tribes, what should we do? How should we approach affairs so that we can maintain peace? And of course, one of the tenets was the seventh generation principle, that before we make any decision, we will consider how this impacts 7 generations down the line. Well, we have to understand, we have to incorporate that very same wisdom into what we're doing and acknowledge that there were things that were done 7 generations ago and before that absolutely impact us today. So there has to be a historical perspective on this kind of racial trauma. This is where we might blend this with an understanding of historical transgenerational trauma. So I don't need to certainly preach. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these ideas, but we have to understand this idea, this intergenerational cycle of trauma and the intergenerational response to trauma that this really produces, that it's passed down from one generation to another. How? Through parenting styles, through storytelling, through environment, even through biology, you know, the emerging research in epigenetics, how trauma can be manifested, how it can be passed down from one generation to another by way of genetic mutation, if not properly processed from one generation to another. So this idea that it's passed down to us, that we inherit the impact of that trauma. And so if we have generations of people who have suffered as entire communities, unimaginable traumas, it stands to reason that we begin to see it manifest itself in their certainly descendants. This is one of the reasons why there's so much to be said. But I just wanted to briefly give spotlight to Joy DeGruy's work, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, and this is a very powerful work, in my opinion. We use it a great deal in our work with the Neighborhood Resilience Project, and it really provides this historical context for understanding the perceptions and behaviors of African Americans that are absolutely a result of slavery, and how there are instances where we have adapted in order to survive in slavery, and those practices that were adaptive in the institution of slavery have become maladaptive. I'm reminded of a story that Joy DeGruy tells about 3 women that were watching their sons play basketball. The 3 sons, 2 of them white, 1 of them black, and the 2 white mothers were bragging on their sons. One couldn't brag more than the other, and they both turned to the African-American woman and said, "What about you? Aren't you proud of your son? He was every bit as good as them, on the honor roll, star athlete, all the rest of it." And she responded, "Well, you don't know the half of it. He doesn't listen. He doesn't clean up. She gave this litany of things that was wrong with him. And Joy DeGruy goes on to say, she makes the sociological connection between what that mother did and what the experience of African Americans were in slavery. When in slavery, slaves were sold on average at least once in his or her lifetime. I would encourage us to read the slave narratives that give these brutal accounts, these horrific accounts of children being separated from their parents violently. And this was the experience of African Americans. So these children that were being bought because they were well-behaved, because they could be quick learners, not to be confused with intelligence, quick learners, because they were obedient. So if these mothers could portray their children as slow learners, disobedient, problem children, that hopefully at the very least, they would be their children. They wouldn't be bought and sold by the slave master. And over centuries, what was an adaptive behavior for survival becomes a maladaptive parenting style. Understanding, where do we see these examples of this in our community that are a direct result of historical of historical trauma. She talks about post-traumatic slave syndrome being multi-generational trauma together with continued oppression, putting that with the absence of opportunity and access to benefits, that leads to post-traumatic slave syndrome, which she says these three main elements of this are vacant esteem. You know, people talk about, well, they have low self-esteem. Well, I will tell you what, low self-esteem is not as bad as no self-esteem. I'm talking about people who have no self-worth. They truly believe themselves to be worthless. We're talking about ever-present anger. People are just angry. You know, sometimes we have community meetings, and in the very tone of the community meeting from the very beginning is anger. I've seen this many times. I've seen anger displayed in community meetings that's misplaced, anger displays that seems out of character, out of place. And yet at the same time, it's there and it's common. Where does this ever-present anger come from? There are historical roots to it. And finally, racist socialization. Socialization, you know, doesn't just happen. Racism is a construct. So whenever we talk about this, racism as a construct, we understand that we are socialized to view different races in derogatory manners, in manners that put them below other races. There's a whole process around this that our society raises up. That's very much a part of who we are as Americans. And so really understanding that there are people of color who also go through this racist socialization and how it really impacts people of color. So I want to introduce another concept to you, and this is the concept of trauma-affected community. Trauma-affected community, this is a concept that we use in our work, the Neighborhood Resilience Project. And this is where we begin to talk about that there are some communities that have a disproportionate experience of trauma. Their disproportionate experience of trauma. The very first experience I had with this was whenever we did a pilot study in my own home community, the Hill District in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And at that time, you know, the ACE study, of course, 4 or higher is the score to everybody pay attention to. If you have a score of 4 or higher, it puts you at increased risk for a negative impact on adult health and behavior. Of course, we know this. But what was so interesting was, 14% of Americans had a score of 4 or higher ACEs. Of course, this is very alarming. But when we did a pilot study in the Hill District, which was a very small sample set randomly selected, the results were 61% had a score of 4 or higher. So we begin to talk about disproportionate experience of trauma in the context of historical trauma. This is where we begin to talk about what does it mean to have trauma-affected community, where there are unhealthy norms that emerge as a result of trauma. We're talking about a shared experience of suffering that characterizes the personal experiences of many in the community. We have a trauma response team. In the trauma response team, we respond to homicides as a result of gun violence across Allegheny County here in Pennsylvania. And we responded to one homicide. There was a young man who had witnessed the murder. There was a 25-year-old man who was shot and killed in the street, and the shooters ran over his body. On the way out, the young man saw the whole thing, and he was explaining to me. He was telling me exactly what happened. He was recounting in gruesome detail what he had witnessed, but he was numb about it. And when he finished recounting the story, he said to me, "But that's all right, because it's normal." That was his words to me. I contrasted that with what I was hearing near the same time, those children, our dear children, the Parkland, Florida shooting that they had survived, the advocates they had become. And what I heard them essentially saying was, this is not normal. This is not supposed to happen. Society broke its agreement with us. That's what I heard them saying. That was completely different with what the young man said. I mean, he said it is normal. This worldview that embraces this as a normal, where the culture of the community is informed first and foremost by trauma, where trauma becomes the foundation upon which the community worldview is laid. This is very important because as we understand it, Whenever we do these individual interactions with people trying to help them heal, it's one thing if you're trying to address personal trauma, personal behavior, but it's a whole nother thing if you're asking someone to essentially go against their culture. Culture is a very, very powerful force. And if there are unhealthy norms that emerge as a result of trauma, unhealthy cultural norms that emerge as a result of multi-generational complex community trauma, it becomes very challenging to try to help someone with personal healing without acknowledging the need for collective healing and community transformation. So this is the backdrop that we can perhaps visit what it means really to be an anti-racist. I am certainly no expert in this, and I know there are people here on this call who are much more proficient with this. But certainly we have to acknowledge there's a choice that we make, that we are not neutral in this. We either are feeding into a system of racism or personal racism or structural racism, institutional racism, systemic racism. We're feeding into this, or we're working against it. This is a radical reorientation of our consciousness. Yes, I like this quote by Ibram Kendi: "To be an anti-racist is a radical choice in the face of history, requiring a radical reorientation of our consciousness." It's obviously a very powerful statement. We go on to say, we're talking about anti-racist, that there's a conscious decision to make frequent, consistent, equitable choices daily. Okay, we don't want to unconsciously uphold aspects of white supremacy, but there are choices that we make. There are choices that we make every day. We are either feeding into this or we are actively working against it. Now, there are a whole, obviously, workshops and trainings around what this looks like and how we do this. I just want to put this here just for some thought. You know, I know that some on here are more experienced with this than I, but I just wanted to feed this. So if we really talk about anti-racist work, we have at the same time to acknowledge that there is a deep need for healing. This is very important. And I would argue that this is the piece in America that we very often overlook. Investing in Community Healing Act 2020, what an extraordinary thing. I've not heard this in American history before. What does healing look like? Very often it is the case that when we think about victory, victory comes on a battlefield or it comes in the halls of government. But brothers and sisters, there's no victory without healing. We have to acknowledge that. And we've had an abolitionist movement and we've had a civil rights movement. And I would encourage us to consider having a healing movement and to ask the question, what does healing look like for these United States? If one man is beating another with a baseball bat, and we work against that beating, we work to take the bat away from him. We even work to get him to change his mind and change his heart and lose the desire to beat his brother. Even if we're successful in that, someone is still lying bloody and beaten on the ground. And there is still work to do. What we do as Americans so often is try to take the bat away without paying any attention to our neighbor bleeding on the ground. What I hope is that with the trauma-informed work, that this is where we can begin to have some synergy. We have got to take the bat away, or even, dare I say, move to a place where we lose the desire to beat one another. This is ultimately where we need to go. And yet at the same time, even if we do that, we have to advance healing. Now, healing, is not something that's completely foreign to the American lexicon. It's, I think our Civil War provides the greatest example of healing that I can think of in the United States, in American history. Of course, we have this painting of Appomattox Courthouse, General Grant and Robert E. Lee, with the surrender of Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia. And we see that very soon after, the nation, of course, there was a period of brutal Reconstruction, but there would be a period after that where the nation would make peace with one another and move towards healing and reconciliation. This photograph is taken from 1913. This is the 1913 Gettysburg Reunion. These men are Union and Confederate veterans. This is the wall at Pickett's Charge, the famous Pickett Charge. Of course, this is an extraordinary battle in which 50,000 Americans were either killed, wounded, or missing. These men here in 1913 are this is the American peace. This is the American healing. This is perhaps one of the most poignant moments in American history, where we, despite that violent bloodshed that marked that period of our nation, came together and embraced in the spirit of healing and national reconciliation. This was the aftermath of the Civil War for white America. This was the aftermath of the Civil War for African Americans. And this, brothers and sisters, and this, clearly we can see that certainly the war was replaced with terrorism. There was no concerted effort to heal. And actually, I thought I might read very briefly an excerpt from Up From Slavery, Booker T. Washington, who of course was born a slave, but then went on to develop the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, doing some absolutely extraordinary work. And he writes about the moment that they heard that they were freed. And he says about this, for some minutes there was great rejoicing and thanksgiving and wild scenes of ecstasy, but there was no feeling of bitterness. In fact, there was pity among the slaves for our former owners. The wild rejoicing on the part of the emancipated colored people lasted but for a brief period. For I noticed that by the time they returned to their cabins, there was a change in their feelings. The great responsibility of being free, of having charge of themselves, of having to think and plan for themselves and their children seemed to take possession of them. It was very much like suddenly turning a youth of 10 or 12 years out into a world to provide for himself. In a few hours, the great questions with which the Anglo-Saxon race had been grappling for centuries had been thrown upon these people to be solved. These were the questions of a home, a living, a rearing of children, education, citizenship, and establishment and support of churches. Was it any wonder that within a few hours, the wild rejoicing ceased and a feeling of deep gloom seemed to pervade the slave quarters? Well, you know, I would argue that with military and political victory, there's perhaps moments of rejoicing and ecstasy before the reality of centuries of multi-generational complex trauma sets in all over again. The Little Rock Nine. Oh yes, we integrated the schools. At what cost? And no one came to those children to say, let's work on healing. No, as a nation, of course, the people around them did. But our nation, as a nation, we never went to those children and said, what can we do to help you heal from the trauma of this? Your only sin, your only crime, going to school. What does it mean, really? We talk about being trauma informed. What does that mean as we reflect on the pain that has been inflicted upon millions in this country? We're familiar with the trauma-informed principles, no doubt, but now it's time to consider how we apply them to a nation in the context of our anti-racist work. It's not enough to work against racist policies and attitudes. We've got to foster a true sense of healing, healing-centered practices. And certainly we can talk about healing-centered practices as a person, but we need to understand healing-centered practices now as community, as states, as a nation, healing-centered practices, that we have the capacity to grow from what happened, post-traumatic growth. We have to identify strengths inherent to an individual community as the foundation of healing. We have to encourage introspection, not only as an individual, but as a nation, as a community, as neighborhoods, as states, to develop self-discovery, self-worth, healing. And how do we do this? Through engagement, empowerment. Even how are we caring for our communities? How are we caring for our communities without guilt? Now, I want to say that this really cannot happen without reconciliation. I will tell you that we have to, and understanding that reconciliation, we're talking about a change from a state of enmity and fragmentation to one of harmony and fellowship. This is what we have to get at. We can't just settle for, winning these victories, but there has to be a restoration of relations to harmony and fellowship, reconciliation. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the height of the Civil Rights Movement, they asked demonstrators to sign a commitment card and asked them to agree to seek, and I quote, justice and reconciliation, not victory. And so it's very important that we understand there cannot be justice without reconciliation, that the two go together. And part of our healing has to be in relationship with one another, and how we do to reestablish those, and what we do to reestablish those relationships in the name of justice, a nation that has so often claimed to uphold justice. What we do to establish those relationships in the name of justice becomes the reconciliation necessary to have justice, and also set us on the path for healing. I want to just introduce this quote that came from the Just City Assembly at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, which I was privileged to participate in some time ago, because we use equity a lot. But out of this came this quote. What does equity mean? Well, I mean, what does it even mean? We serve as vague, varied, often non-positional definitions. Justice demands a clear stance on fairness because it illuminates a wrong that needs to be corrected. We must not be afraid to illuminate wrongs that need corrected. This is incredibly important. Sometimes we are, as Americans, afraid to illuminate wrongs. Somehow we think it's going to diminish who we are in the history of our nation. Oh no, we've got to illuminate wrongs that need corrected. Martin Luther King, of course, live together as brothers or perish together as fools. And I would just challenge us to consider how other countries, in the aftermath of political or military victory, took up the cause for healing. Of course, famously, truth and reconciliation commissions, where we acknowledge as a nation publicly what sins have committed, the suffering of people. There's public forgiveness. We have public confession with immunity. How we go about doing this begins to create a healing narrative that our nation desperately needs. We need to understand what something like this looks like in these United States of America, and we cannot afford to wait for another generation. Yeah, this list is by no means exhaustive, but just to provoke conversation. What does healing look like on a public level, in a national level? Where we bear witness to offenses, where we listen to people and how they've suffered, where we make a way for public confession with immunity, so people can talk, they can come forward openly and confess for the racist policies and behaviors that they've done, where we can publicly forgive and say we acknowledge that, we are willing to forgive and move on. Certainly we need to change policy. These policies that continue to reinforce racist oppression in parts of our country. And I know the word's controversial, reparations. We could also talk about resource distribution. There are some of our communities that have been intentionally divested of. You talk about redlining in some of our communities. You talk about with education, gun violence, health disparities. Just take a map of redlining and put it over top of that. And often we will find that they coincide. So we've got to make good on what happened for so long in these communities in terms of resource distribution. I would also argue that we need to have continued public reflection and self-examination, because this isn't an exercise that we could just do once as a nation and then move on. We need to work this in. Can you imagine if we had, we have Black History Month. Can you imagine if we had Truth and Reconciliation Month every year? Because I will tell you, I would guess there will be more wounds in that past year. And finally, racial socialization, which is where we're helping our young people of color come to terms in a positive way with the beauty, the strength, the heritage that is theirs, in a way that gives them a proper perspective on who they truly are, not who a racist society has led them to believe they are. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but I would just close with these words from an African-American spiritual. In terms of healing, those who have experienced racism need certainly to heal. And I would argue that those who are the perpetrators of racism, racist policy and behavior also need to heal. I remember seeing a man one time, a firefighter. He did something abhorrent. He was slow to respond to a fire because it was the housing of a Black family that was burning. And he wouldn't move to put the fire out. Those lousy, no good N-word, he said, I hope the whole place burns down. I witnessed it. The family survived, but they lost everything. And I witnessed that when he said it, it was almost as if I could say now, a piece of him died. When he forsook his brother, he forsook himself. And I look back and see now it left a wound. So we need all kind of healing. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. Let this be our healing movement. And let us be about this work with the same courage, determination, love, dignity, and hope as our many ancestors did. And let us do so not only for ourselves, but for the seventh generation, that they might one day look back on us and give thanks to God for the courageous work that we did for their future.
Father Paul, thank you so much. Power of your words. There was thoughtful action for healing in the future, a vision that we can act from. And truly thank you. In addition to all of that, you certainly gave me goosebumps that I believe will last a week at least. And with that, I will waste no more time in introducing Teena Brooks to talk about implementing race equity into communities.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to echo that goosebumps for a year. Thank you so much for really just that powerful statement. I'm still shaking a little bit. I also just, before I start, I just want to acknowledge some of the wonderful conversations that are happening in the chat room. I'm going to highlight some of the comments. I'll start for healing, addressing forgiveness, and start the healing process. There are also some wonderful resources. What can America learn from South Africa about national healing? I also recommend the work of Dr. Kendis Watson on healing the damage of racial trauma on cells. And I'm not sure what that word is, Temaloes. Someone's gonna have to help me with that word. But again, thank you for giving me this opportunity to present. I'm gonna pull up my slides. And I want to talk with you today about my experiences in working around implementation. And as Jesse said in my introduction, I am adjunct faculty at Columbia University School of Social Work, but I also work for the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And I didn't get formal approval for my presentation today, so I didn't share that, but it certainly really provides a lot of the foundation for my thinking about this work and where I think we need to go from the really powerful and profound vision that Father Paul outlined for us, and why we're not there just quite yet. So if you can give me just a second, I will pull up my slides and we will go ahead and start. Jesse, actually, in the interest of time, could you actually pull up my slides?
Absolutely.
Thanks.
One second here.
So while Jesse's doing that, I actually wanted to start the presentation just by asking folks to really sort of think about what this community Father Paul has envisioned might look like. And if folks want to unmute themselves for a moment, or if they want to add some comments into the chat room, I think that that's a great way for us to sort of continue this conversation. What's the vision for this community where trauma, resilience, and anti-racist practice are all integrated? What does that look like? President-elect from Dan, President-elect Biden talks about healing. We need to find a way to get healing, to get this vision of healing in from the administration, and perhaps task Vice President-elect Harris to head to a healing commission or task force. Any thoughts on how to do this? Whole person and whole community health. Some really great concepts and ideas. So I want to keep, if folks want to keep chatting those thoughts, I'm going to go ahead and start. So again, what I want to do today is talk about some of the work that I've done through my practice, largely from the vantage point of local government, to really think about what the integration of trauma-informed care and equity looks like. And I have to say, I really am moved by this idea of really moving from equity to thinking about justice and what that looks like and means in the context of our work. Next slide, Jesse. So I'm going to give you some background. I also want to share a draft equity statement that the National Trauma Campaign has been working to develop, and really ask for your involvement in advancing this important work of the national campaign. Next slide. We can move to the next slide. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So let's start here. Let's spend a little bit more time with this idea of trauma-informed care and equity. What's the relationship? I want to have this discussion always, because I think, we make an assumption sometimes that we all sort of share the same ideas about what this work looks like and how it impacts the way we work. I been preparing for this presentation, was thinking a lot of the work that Trauma Free Oregon does, and particularly Mandy Davis in 2018 wrote an article that I think was an ACES connection on this very topic, and equity, trauma-informed care and equity, what's the relationship? And there's some really, I think, critical questions we have to ask ourselves. Is equity work trauma-informed? Does trauma-informed care address equity? And how do we center equity into the trauma and resilience movement? And I think she had some really great insights on that and on some of these questions can our equity work be trauma informed? And I think for me, if we're really working from an equity perspective, then that definitely that work can be trauma informed. Often what happens is that trauma informed work in underrepresented communities is not necessarily honored as trauma informed. A lot of the work that is happening in the communities that Father Paul speaks of is trauma informed, but we don't necessarily give it that name or that language, because trauma and resilience means something different in those communities. So we're not necessarily giving it that title, but that work is happening. And does trauma-informed care address equity? I think as Father Paul so nicely alluded to, it can and it should, but there really has to be that intention with how we're thinking about that work. So really sort of building on that question and thinking about how do we center equity in the trauma and resilience movement? And that's been a lot of my work and my focus, my background. For many years, I spent doing equity work and focusing on equity, inclusion, and anti-racist practice. In the past, more recent years, I've been more actively involved in the trauma and resilience movement in New York State. And I think my initial and immediate response of course, these two worlds align. It makes very good logical sense that they should. And as I go throughout my presentation, what you'll see, and we'll talk about how that's been more difficult and more challenging to create that sort of synergy that we really want to see. And a lot of the issues and the reasons why I think sort of are really outlined nicely by Father Paul and some of the definitions and the concepts that he introduced us to around thinking about healing from racial trauma. I think that was really important and such an important foundation. However, I think sometimes when we're thinking about the work and what we're calling in trauma-informed care, often racial trauma ends up in another sort of category. It's added into our work, but it's not necessarily driving our work. So we don't really see the sort of synergy and the sort of real holistic integration that I think we're all envisioning and we're hoping for. So I want to issue that challenge in that thought of how we get there. And there's some wonderful ideas that are thoughts that are being chatted out, but want to keep coming back to that question and how do we get there and what does that look like? Next slide. So two really important things that I think we really need to think about is just really recognizing that a lot of the trauma and resilience work, our work has been important and powerful and profound, but it's also been grounded in white dominant culture ideas of trauma and healing. Working for a Department of Health for the past 6 months, a lot of my work has been around working with communities through the pandemic and trying to talk with communities about trauma and resilience and healing. And one of the immediate pieces of feedback that I received, we were talking about things like self-care and messaging things that were aligned with the literature and the research that we were aware of as a health department. And the immediate response is, what does that even mean? My reality, I don't have time. I'm a caregiver. I work full time. I don't know what you mean by self-care. And there's so many of those examples that I could go on and share. Those moments where we lost an opportunity, potential to really engage communities in a meaningful way because we really focused on terminology and concepts that we use a lot, but are not necessarily relevant to many of the communities we're trying to engage. The second thing that I think is really very important that we don't do enough is really ask some of the hard questions. And I think one of the hardest one is, how has the trauma-informed movement, how is it helping or hurting your work to promote wellness in your community? And I would add anti-racist practice to that as well. I think sometimes we don't ask because maybe we're afraid to know and receive that feedback. But in terms of thinking about moving toward thinking about implementation and visioning, I think we have to ask that question. We really need to engage communities in a very real conversation about what this movement is. Do they even understand it as a movement? And how is it helping or how is it not helping them move forward? I think that is the beginning of a more honest conversation that we want to be having with the people that we serve. Next slide. So with that foundation, I want to now talk a little bit about some of the work that I've done at the Department of Health around equity and trauma and resilience, with hopefully an idea of giving you some examples, but also showing you some of the barriers and struggles that we have as a health department. We began an initiative about 4 years ago called Race to Justice, and it's based on, this is work from the Center for Social Inclusion and the Local and Regional Government Alliance on Race and Equity. So we work with them in consultation to develop this framework, and not developing, this is their framework, but really adapting it to our work. And it's really built on this idea of building this capacity to advance racial equity and social justice and all the work that we do. So we started by really thinking about how do we normalize conversations around race and racism, anti-racist practice. So really, how do we build a shared analysis? And how do we operate with some urgency to start building that analysis? And some of that work happened through forums and platforms very similar to this, where we're bringing together stakeholders to talk about what does this mean? What does this work mean for us as a health department? What does this mean for the communities that we serve? And then really thinking about how to operationalize some of these things using racial equity tools and using data and different metrics to sort of look at and think about and measure some of these things and develop resources to really think about how to do better interventions. And we developed a community engagement framework that we've been able to implement as an agency and throughout the city to really think about how to meaningfully engage our stakeholders in the communities that we work with. And then the very last part of the framework is really organizing. How do we come together and start to build a really intentional infrastructure and think about partnering with others to achieve this vision that we have talked about of equity. And again, going back to Father Paul's presentation, because it was so powerful, it's thinking about the conversations and his presentations and the things are being chatted out. How do we really sort of move forward and start to organize and operationalize some of these ideas? And we have, as a department, moved forward with doing some strategic planning and looking to really be able to create some meaningful change within our communities and the communities we serve. At the same time, we also began a process of looking at trauma-informed care and thinking about how to implement it into our work. And interestingly enough, I think it's always the story that this never happens together. This process happens separate and apart from our Race to Justice framework, which I think is part of the struggle that we go through sometimes in thinking about what integration looks like. Next slide, Jesse. So the TRIA Task and Finish Group was an initiative that we started a few years ago, and based on just reviewing literature on trauma and resilience and using the principles from the Substance Use and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, looking at trauma and resilience informed systems and really starting to look at our organization and how it relates to community and thinking about were our services trauma informed? And if not, what did that mean for us to get there? Some of the immediate things that we found with the SAMHSA framework is that it didn't really have a discussion of resilience and structural racism or bias. So that was something that we sort of struggled with. And through that process, we really started to think about and categorize services and really sort of get to the core of like, what are we even calling trauma informed? And we developed a matrix. We also developed a list of recommendations for strategic action moving forward. So fast forward to the pandemic, when everything started to happen and the world seemed to just sort of shift so drastically. There was really this urgency and this need to think about how do we bring these worlds together. And I'd love to tell you that we figured it all out, but we surely have not. A lot of our work has been trying to figure out where the synergy lies between those worlds in the way that only people in government can, somewhat slowly, but still with making progress with identifying some objectives and some goals and thinking about our work moving forward. So all of this to say, to provide some foundation, I think, to some of the struggles that I hear organizations facing when they're thinking about how to actualize this work and what it looks like in the context of what they want to do. I never hear a shortage of people having a strong passion about these issues, but figuring out how they fit together, I think, is someplace where we all struggle a bit. Next slide, Jesse. Some of the big takeaways, and I think this has been said consistently, representation matters. How we're framing these ideas, how we're bringing these worlds together is really critical in terms of who we have in the room. I was happy to hear Kyle talk about the importance of lived experience, and that representation really needs to be driving the way we think about trauma and resilience and anti-racist practice, because I really think those folks who have that lived experience will guide that narrative and should be guiding that narrative in terms of how we think about that work and what it should look like. Asking the hard questions. We really have to ask those questions. I think sometimes we're afraid to ask if what we're doing is actually helping or doing greater harm, because it's painful to hear the truth. But we know for people who live this experience, that pain is a part of their experience, but healing is also possible. But we really need to be able to be honest and sit down and start that conversation and really begin that reckoning and thinking about how these worlds and how these concepts really align. The last lesson learned, I think, is a big one. Transformation is not a linear process. None of this work really happens in a way, at least from my experience, it is at all linear. So much of my practice has been starting thinking that I wanted to move in one direction, listening to the data, listening to communities, and then going in another, and really thinking about what the best way is to move forward, and really just being uncertain sometimes about what that looks like. And that's painful and it's difficult, but I think it's part of the important work that we have to do in really envisioning this world that I think people have so much passion for. Next slide. So that being said, I have started to work with the national campaign and starting to think about equity, what equity looks like in the context of the National Trauma Campaign. And I think Jesse can attest, it's been a really challenging, at times, deeply uncomfortable position for me, because I think sometimes there is a reality that some of this work has existed on parallel paths. So one of the things that we've been talking about doing is developing an equity statement, and we have a draft that I will read for you, and would definitely love to hear your thoughts and your feedback on as we continue to refine this. We really want this to be the foundation of our work and the work of the National Trauma Campaign moving forward, to really sort of see and envision the change that I think that we're also passionate about. So I'll go ahead and read it. The National Trauma Campaign is estimated to be a 5 to 10 year venture, mobilizing advocates and educating Congress, developing a comprehensive trauma-informed federal vision, and working with communities to ensure that policies are comprehensive and reach those most in need. Though the campaign is finite, we hope that its legacy goes on much longer. Through our communities and networks, we hope to be part of the movement as driving cultural change to make the world a better place. A culture that values human life and consistently maintains a holistic continuum of support to engage communities and individuals. To do this, the campaign acknowledges the need to first address how white supremacy practices have historically promoted exclusion within our movement, and envision a campaign guided by the individuals and communities directly impacted by racial trauma and toxic stress. This is why every aspect of the campaign will be viewed through an equity lens. To ensure inclusion of diverse stakeholders, the campaign will partner with communities to draft a vision for a trauma-informed society, using local liaisons or regional leaders who reflect the diversity of the communities being served. We will partner with community stakeholders to learn the cultural norms and values of the target communities and leverage these partnerships to maximize our outreach efforts, creating buy-in, fostering collaboration, participation in community ownership, trust building, and community acceptance will be campaign cornerstones. Consequently, successful collaborations will be based on transparency and shared leadership. So I think this is a powerful statement and what we hope is a bold charge for the National Trauma Campaign. But I think statements like this are only as good as the people creating accountability for them. So I want to encourage you to join us first by supporting this vision and this equity statement. We definitely would love to hear your feedback on this statement and let us know if it goes far enough, if there's language that feels really important that's missing from this statement. I'm looking at my time and realizing that I know we want to leave time for questions, so I want to end here now. And thank you for the opportunity and what I know will be an ongoing and really important conversation. Thank you.
Teena, thank you so much. With that, let's open the floor. Do folks have questions, thoughts? The last thing that I want to say is if we don't get to your thought about the equity vision in this conversation, please feel free to email me and we will certainly take that into account. This is going to be an ongoing thing, but with that, I'll open the floor so that way our three presenters can answer questions, field thoughts, and feedback.
Are you inviting auditory comments or just chat?
Auditory comments are great. If you are more comfortable to put them in the chat, I am happy to look at those as well and read those off as they come in.
Well, I just would say this is, again, compliments to CTIPP for working on this and Ms. Brooks for bringing forward her work. So many things stand out, but I think the one that really stands out for me is to ask ourselves that question: are we helping or hurting the racial equity movement with our trauma-informed work? I'm not weighing in one way or the other on that. It's probably both, but depending. But I think it's really important to ask it. And also related to that, obviously, is the voices of the community members and people with lived experience, because trauma and healing may well be different, defined differently in different communities. So anyway, thank you for this work. It's great.
From the perspective of the campaign, one question, and this may relate to others doing community work as well, but being in a white centralized community myself, what is the best way? And Teena, we've spoken about this many times, but so that way others can hear as well. And Father Paul, Kyle, I'm open to your comments and answers, but how do we engage communities of color, communities that frankly just are outside of the communities that we may generally operate within?
Well, I'd offer just one simple thought. As I often think, I've often heard in the trauma-informed movement, people coming in, whites coming into our community. And, as we kind of been talking about, and sometimes the perspective has been, we want to teach you people mindfulness and yoga so you can heal. And, it's certainly not a knock on any of that, but I will tell you, my great grandmother She never learned mindfulness, and believe it or not, no one ever taught her yoga. And somehow she endured the most unimaginable suffering. And I wonder, what is there to learn from this community that is her legacy? There's a great deal to learn from people who have suffered a great deal. I would introduce, a very interesting term here. The term would be liberal white supremacy. Liberal white supremacy, which actually comes from the Harvard, it was in the Harvard Business Review. If I could find the definition, and this is the definition of liberal white supremacy: the tendency of white people to constantly place themselves in superior moral position. This takes many forms. Some want to compete for the title of most woke progressive. Some show up to insert themselves in conversations about racial and economic inequality only when it becomes popular or high profile to do so. And this is where I think we can challenge ourselves in the trauma-informed movement, because I think sometimes we inadvertently are guilty of precisely this liberal white supremacy, ignoring what these communities have to offer us all, that we can learn from. So all this to say that humility is always the best way. I think if we could see people approaching some communities more to learn than they were to teach, we might be getting somewhere as movement. It's just a thought.
This is Kyle. I'm gonna quickly echo what Paul mentioned. I'm also gonna say I'm very glad that y'all had me go before Teena and before Paul to go first. So that was a great set on the agenda side. I know something that, my boss and the Congresswoman is big on, and a lot of advocates within Delaware as well. It's just really providing opportunities for those who are, again, just the ones with the experience to inform, what those strategy sessions look like offline, online, roundtable, like a lot of the standard things that we normally get. But I remember something that happened during a lot of the protests this summer in Delaware and Wilmington, when leaders were meeting with different activists and just people in community. And a lot of times those with the infrastructure in place to make change happen were asking people like, what do you need? And like, what can we do? And the easiest answer that they were giving just said, we just need money. Like, we don't need, you to do anything else, but provide us the money to do what we already do best. And I think, that's something that I'm reading in some of the language of CTIPP, and I'm glad Paul and Teena, you offer that in terms of just empowering people, and to less think about trying to educate them or trying to provide them with information in which, poor people have been poor a long time, people experiencing trauma. And you talk about PTSS and things that are passed down through generations have been experiencing trauma for a very long time. So, while different techniques and tools may be helpful, sometimes it's just about giving them the resources and the stage to lift up and to stand up the ways in which they already communicate with community. But that can be a little bit of a push and a pull sometimes with the way that things are traditionally done, in the way that we see equity. But like we heard, the way we're trying to move into doing what's just is sometimes a further step and a step to the side sometimes.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Kyle. I think that you would have done well anywhere that you fell. I see, Teena, that you came off mute. I just want to quickly acknowledge that we were supposed to end at 3:30. I am happy to stay around until 4. I can't speak for our speakers, of course. But if folks want to stay around, have this community conversation, I will be here. Teena, with that, please. Whatever.
I just wanted to elevate some of the comments that were happening in the chat. Thanks for the important point, Father Paul. It makes me think of what Brene Brown says. I'm not here to be right, I'm here to get it right. This needs to be the mindset of white folks working in communities of color. White culture is exactive and individualistic, including in how we have dominated trauma-informed care, none of which is healing, but in fact causes harm. just wanted to elevate those points. Also, just going back and thinking about Kyle's comment as someone in government, I think that's a lesson that we sort of had to learn the hard way. Sometimes communities just want us to give them the money and go away. And that's hard to hear because I think in government, we're always tasked with having solution and being able to answer and solve problems. And the communities really do have the solutions often. We just have a hard time listening. So I just wanted to add that observation.
We've got a few more folks coming in through the chat. A quick question here from Deborah. Sometimes grant funders don't want to fund innovative ideas, but want tried and true solutions. I hope that you're proud of me doing the quote unquote in real life there. How can we change the minds of grant funders to be more anti-racist and trauma informed?
I'll say something that goes back to, this is Kyle, going back to the social determinants of health. There's a few states, I think at the local level as well as across the nation, that have tried to implement health impact assessments. So essentially, these tools that says, like, before we put this policy, this practice, into place, what's going to be the anticipated impact on a community's overall health? We do this with, epilogue language, within a lot of our bills, but also thinking about, what that looks like on a population's overall health before that thing is put into place. I think with grant funders, a lot of times what we think about is interest convergence and trying to find that sweet spot. But I think keeping, people's livelihoods, if this pandemic has taught us nothing else, it's hard to bet against the preservation of life when we're confronting it, across the board. And if we can show the ways in which, people's lives and communities' lives will overall be improved, I think that's a good benchmark to start at. I don't think it's an end all be all by any means that's going to convince, all funders, but starting with the ways that, a healthy population and a healthy community leads to better education systems and leads to better workforce and better, just overall structures in the ways people can contribute to society. I think that's a good place to start. But again, I think that health equity or health impact assessments and seeing that put into place, not just so we're researching a problem after the fact to say, like, hey, how did we do? But before we put it into place, we're really thinking about, what is its overall purpose and who is it going to impact with equity in mind.
I would definitely agree with that. I also think about some of the work and some of the equity tools are really powerful in terms of just building that dialogue and building it into the culture. That's a big part of what we've done as a local government. And I see other agencies around the country doing similar things. And I think when that is embedded into the fiber of your agency, that's one way is we can really look at how we're funding from an equity lens and an equity perspective and make sure that the funding is really being distributed from an equitable perspective, but also addressing issues that really impact the well-being of communities. So I think that social determinants of health and really building that metrics, but also thinking about how we are considering funding from an equity perspective is something really powerful and important that we need to do. And I think some of the foundations have become really thoughtful about that in their funding. I feel like there has been a broader conversation around social determinants of health that I'm hearing that is happening among foundations. So I think that that's a really important opportunity.
There is another question in the chat from Vic, which asks, how might a truth and reconciliation process look in the American context?
I'm not unmuting because I want to try and answer this one because I think it's something that I'm definitely still thinking about. I've been thinking about it since Father Paul talked about it almost 3 months ago. I don't really have a clear answer for that and what that would look like. But I think it's important for us to keep thinking about what that would look like moving forward. So that's sort of me not giving you an answer, but something that I think we sort of need to challenge ourselves around what this looks like and what is truth and healing. What does that mean for communities and communities of color? I think it's something that we're still very much wrestling with as a society.
If I may, my first job out of college was working in a Philadelphia public high school that was 95% Black. And it is an incomplete answer to your question, Vic, because it is far from the only thing that needs to be done. But investing in education that is currently so funded by local governments that have been marred by legacies of redlining, socioeconomic oppression, and investing in schools so that way there is school. I mean, the buildings aren't falling apart. They have up-to-date curriculum and the same opportunities that I had growing up 7 miles away. You know, that is a start that would start to work toward a better future, right? And greater equity and equality, at least equity. And so I think that that's been something that I've always felt needs to be a piece, definitely not the whole solution, but certainly a piece of it.
Want to elevate another comment in the chat. Include those with lived experience to co-develop solutions and shift power and decision-making to those with lived experience. I mean, I think that that's something in terms of reconciliation and healing for voices to be heard. I think it is a really powerful and important part of healing. So I just want to elevate that comment and definitely agree strongly with it in terms of thinking about how we bring people to this conversation to really move forward with healing.
I'd like to underscore something Father Abernathy said, which deals with as the example, his grandmother and, you know, his ancestors who had their own ways of healing, and they probably didn't have anything to do with meditation or yoga per se, which is, you know, if we're looking to engage, I think we need to try to find links to people who are already doing great things in the context of their culture and their values and their history, and then support those. You know, as a starting place to engage. Why would you engage with someone who doesn't recognize the value of what you're doing? So, you know, if there aren't already links to communities doing those really, you know, culturally, contextually linked things that help them, you know, survive in these difficult contexts, then we should start doing that. Find them and support them.
Could could I ask a question, or is there a queue on the chat?
It's all you, Brett.
Awesome. First of all, thank you so much for to Teena and Kyle. I'm not sure if Father Abernathy is still on the call, but thank you guys so much for speaking. There's a question that came to my mind. I recently finished reading the book How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. And if I understood it correctly, he was talking about policy versus changing the hearts and mind of people. And I think many times we think of it as intertwined movements, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are. Again, if I understand his argument, is almost that policy maybe should come first and we should stop waiting for people to, I guess, change, or we should stop waiting for enough minds to be changed before implementing policy, because many times policy changes can bring benefits to people who maybe were against it because of the optics or because of political affiliations or other sort of group affiliations, or what the media maybe is telling them about, reform in healthcare, or in this case, trauma-based initiatives or policies. I'm wondering what your thoughts are in regards to sort of what could be considered a chicken or the egg phenomenon, in terms of, do you change hearts and minds and then you implement policy? Should policies be more so centered before, waiting for a certain portion of the population to come around to what experts in the field probably have been suggesting for a long time should be implemented?
My personal feeling in response to that is, I may never see hearts and minds change in my lifetime. And that's just a hard reality. And there's so much urgency for me, and I think for all of us in this work, and the change happens. So I don't feel like I'm willing to wait and hope that hearts and minds change. I think that's, the work of becoming anti-racist is lifelong work. It's really that systemic. So for me, I think the policy needs to be in place, because that really builds in the accountability for what does and does not happen in our society. So that's my response, and others may see it differently.
Thanks for that question, Brett. I am in agreement, and I would say I'll just answer by citing two other people. There's somebody, words that I know, Derica Purnell, who wrote an article earlier this summer, and she said something about, like, if abolitionists waited to convince everybody that liberation was worth the pursuit, right? That the end of slavery was worth it, we might still have slavery, within this country, right? And that, that word and that connotation about, they were essentially trying to defund plantations at that time, right? So these words and these ideas are not as new as some of these conversations today may have them, may make them. And I know something that my boss, Congresswoman Blunt Rochester, has said. She mentioned during a criminal justice reform panel, and she said sometimes, like, we have an extensive array of legislation that's out there, right? And that we have the bills, but do we have the will to actually get those things over the finish line? So I think it's a yes and I think also important is that, every tool in our toolbox sometimes can have a home when we're trying to fix it, or we're trying to build one. And we don't have to throw anything out. So I think sometimes you may need the hearts and minds in those rooms, but for those who can make that change at the policy or at the legislative level, or at the practice level, sometimes when we think about policy, we think about state, local government, but there's policies within our work culture, within childcare, right, within schools, right, that little things that, can be switched and adjusted as well. They don't have to be big P's, but they can be little P's as well that make big changes. So I think maybe a yes and approach would be helpful as well.
Thank you so much.
Let me throw a suggestion out there too. It may not be hearts and minds, but Congress moves very slowly. Policy clearly can make a difference, as we saw with the Civil Rights Act. They didn't wait for the hearts and minds, but the Civil Rights Act would not have been enacted were it not for the grassroots movement that created such strong pressure on Congress to do it. And then you saw the same thing with AIDS, with opioids. So you may not focus on changing the hearts and minds of everybody out there, but what you need to do is build a grassroots movement that gets Congress's attention to make them feel like this is an idea whose time has come. And that's really what CTIP's long-term objective is to build that bandwagon that brings Congress along with it.
Dan, one thing that makes me think of is in the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. She talks about a difficult sort of counterbalance, and I've experienced this as well and had to overcome it in college, where white people feel comfortable being silent during conversations that are frankly inappropriate and in changing the hearts and minds. I mean, for everybody on this call, especially white folks who can more easily hide behind these difficult conversations, one person at a time. When you hear something that's wrong, coming out and speaking to it, and standing up for what we know to be right is critically important. The policies are obviously important and we're working toward that, but on an individual basis, to stand up and speak out, even in small circles or one-on-one conversations, and let people know that is not okay to say, this is the truth, is incredibly important and necessary to be done, and too frequently just ignored as a responsibility.
I think also people value having tools. I think a lot of people want to do quote the right thing, but really are looking for tools. And I'm thinking about a webinar we recently had featuring Dr. Howard Stevenson at Penn. And he's developed specific tools that he has published about, including, I don't have it right at my fingertips, but basically how to manage racially sensitive encounters, RSEs. And yeah, I think what we want to do is find people who want to do the right thing, and again, support them and provide the tools, help provide bridges between ideas that may be difficult for people to handle. So I would probably figure out how to get that resource maybe in Dan's hands and get it out to you, the group.
Thank you, Leslie. But Jesse's the one who will get it out to the group. I still use 2 tin cans and a string for communicating.
Okay.
Well, with that, someone feel free to cut me off if there's any more questions, but if not, we have set multiple records on the CTIPP-CAN call, both in terms of participation, as well as certainly the length of time that this call has gone on, and I am grateful for both. Teena and Kyle, Father Paul, if you watch the recording, thank you for sharing your insight with us and teaching us all. And thanks to everybody for sticking around and having such a valuable conversation. Let's keep it going. If it ends today, we didn't do our jobs. If this is the start of something more, then it's a beautiful thing. So if we don't speak before, have happy holidays, a safe and healthy new year, and we look forward to seeing you in January. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Marilyn and Dan. Thanks, Teena. Congresswoman, appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you, Kyle.
Have a safe holiday.
You as well.